My name is Natalie Brooks, and the day the CEO intimidated me into signing a resignation letter is the day he accidentally signed his own exit paperwork, even though he didn't realize it at the time. Because men like him never imagine consequences applying downward and then snapping back upward. I'd been with the company for 4 years as Director of Compliance and Risk, which meant my job wasn't to make friends, it was to make sure leadership didn't burn the place down chasing growth headlines. And that made me inconvenient, especially to Ethan Cole, our charismatic, media-trained CEO who liked to talk about culture while quietly bulldozing anyone who said no to him, and for months I'd been documenting his behavior, pressure to bypass reporting requirements, instructions to soften language in disclosures, verbal orders followed by "let's keep this off email," all the classic red flags that turn into documentaries later. The breaking point came when I refused to sign off on a quarterly filing that I knew misrepresented exposure in one of our overseas divisions, and 2 days later I was summoned to his office after hours, the blinds already drawn, HR seated stiffly in the corner like set dressing, and a single document placed neatly in front of me, titled Voluntary Resignation, with my name already typed at the top, Ethan leaning back in his chair and telling me this was the graceful option, explaining in that calm, practiced voice that compliance leaders who can't align, don't last long in this industry, that if I fought this I'd be unemployable, and that signing would at least let me control the narrative. He didn't yell, didn't threaten explicitly, which is how people like him operate. They implied destruction and let your imagination do the work. But I'd spent too many years in rooms like this not to recognize coercion dressed up as professionalism, and as he spoke, I quietly flipped through the pages, not because I was panicking, but because I was reading, and that's where he made his mistake, because 6 months earlier, during a routine update to executive separation templates, I'd insisted on adding a standard clause tied to change of control and retaliatory termination protections, a clause approved by the board without much thought because it would never apply, and there it was, buried on page 3 of the resignation letter he'd handed me, stating that any resignation executed under material pressure or in response to refusal to certify misleading disclosures would trigger immediate independent review, accelerated vesting, and mandatory disclosure to external auditors. Ethan kept talking while I kept reading, HR avoided my eyes, and when he finally slid the pen toward me and said, "This ends cleanly if you just sign," I nodded, thanked him for clarifying, and signed my name slowly, exactly where indicated, because what he thought was capitulation was actually consent to trigger the very mechanism he'd forgotten existed. The room relaxed instantly, Ethan smiling like he'd just won a chess match, HR collecting the document and assuring me someone would follow up about transition logistics, and I walked out calmly, went home, and forwarded a single scanned copy of the signed letter, his letter, to the board's audit committee chair, external counsel, and our independent compliance monitor with a brief message that read, "Executed under pressure following refusal to approve disclosure, per clause 3.4, and then I waited. By the next afternoon, Ethan's calendar was wiped clean. By the following morning the board announced an emergency review of executive conduct, and by the end of the week, the same man who'd told me I'd never work again was on administrative leave while legal teams dissected emails, meeting notes, and recorded calls I'd quietly preserved, all of which aligned perfectly with the trigger conditions in the resignation he'd forced me to sign. He called me once during that week, voice tight, asking if we could talk this through, and I told him the truth, I already had, just not with him, and when the board released its findings, citing retaliation, disclosure interference, and breach of fiduciary duty, Ethan resigned, for personal reasons, forfeiting his severance, his equity acceleration voided, his reputation quietly escorted out the side door while I received my accelerated vesting, a formal apology from the board, and 3 unsolicited job offers within a month. Because in American corporate life, silence protects abusers until documentation shows up, and I had been documenting everything. People later asked me if I'd been scared signing that letter, and the honest answer is no, because fear is what they count on, what they build systems around. And the irony is that if he'd actually read what he put in front of me, if he'd respected compliance instead of trying to intimidate it, none of this would have happened, but power like his only listens when it's forced. 2. And the moment he tried to use paper to erase me, he handed me the cleanest proof of all, that he believed authority meant immunity, and that belief cost him everything.